My name is Dr. Laura Bennett, and for years most people knew me as a somewhat reserved university professor at Riverside State, teaching advanced economics and international finance. A respectable, if not dazzling profession in the eyes of some. But there was another far more significant truth about my life, a truth I guarded meticulously. They thought I'd never uncover the truth about the gilded cage they called a bank, a monolith built on arrogance and teetering on the brink of disaster. The moment I found out what they really thought of me sitting around their mahogany table dripping with disdain for my little academic pursuits was the moment everything began to unravel. For them. Multiple truths will be revealed in this story, not just about balance sheets and billion-dollar deals gone wrong, but about the fragile veneer of family, the crushing weight of underestimation, and the surprising strength you find when you're pushed to your absolute limit. For years, I'd swallowed their casual dismissals, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, the subtle barbs disguised as well-meaning advice. I let it chip away at me piece by piece until I almost forgot who I truly was outside their opulent, suffocating world. I carried a secret that was both a burden and a weapon, a silent knowledge that would eventually reshape all our lives. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family or had your accomplishments belittled by those who should have cheered, loudest, comment, and subscribe, you're not alone in this. Trust me, if you're someone who believes in quiet strength, the slow burn of intelligence, and the eventual irrefutable triumph of integrity, this story will change how you see family power and the sweet, sweet taste of truth forever. I suppose my story, the one that really matters, began long before I married into the Carrington dynasty. I was Laura Peterson back then, a scholarship kid from a working-class neighborhood where dinner conversations revolved around making ends meet, not hostile takeovers. My parents, a high school history teacher and a registered nurse, instilled in me two core values: the unwavering pursuit of knowledge and an unshakable sense of integrity. They didn't have much in material wealth, but our small home was rich in books, debates, and the quiet dignity of honest work. I remember my father poring over historical texts late into the night, his brow furrowed in concentration, and my mother returning from a grueling 12-hour shift, weary but still finding the energy to ask about my day and encourage my studies. They saw my early aptitude for numbers and complex systems not as a path to riches, but as a tool to understand and perhaps one day improve the world. My passion for economics wasn't just about supply and demand curves. It was about the human stories behind the figures, the societal impact of financial decisions, the intricate dance of global markets that could uplift nations or plunge them into chaos. I devoured books on economic theory, financial history, and regulatory frameworks driven by an insatiable curiosity. I excelled earning scholarships that paved my way through undergraduate and then a prestigious PhD program. It was in graduate school that I met Daniel Carrington. He was different from the other scions of wealthy families I'd occasionally encountered. There was a kindness in his eyes, a genuine interest in my ideas that transcended a polite attempt to understand my niche field. He was studying business administration, clearly on a path to join the family empire Atlantic Fidelity Bank, but he possessed a humility his family seemed to lack. He was charmed by my intellect, my passion, and perhaps by the fact that I wasn't impressed by his last name. We fell in love, a love built on mutual respect, and a shared vision for a future, though our visions of family would prove to be drastically different. Meeting the Carringtons was like stepping onto the set of a movie about the ultra-wealthy, only the script was written by Jane Austen on a particularly acerbic day. Philip Carrington Daniel's father and the CEO of Atlantic Fidelity Bank was an imposing figure in his late 60s. With a mane of silver hair, impeccably tailored suits, and a voice accustomed to instant obedience, he surveyed the world from the lofty perch of inherited power and self-made billions or so he liked to project. He was old money, with a new money hunger for expansion and dominance. His handshake was firm, his eye contact fleeting when it came to me. Eleanor Carrington, his wife, was the quintessential society hostess. early 60s perfectly coiffed her understated jewelry, probably costing more than my parents' annual income. She wielded social pleasantries like a surgeon wields a scalpel. Precise often cutting, but always with a veneer of grace. Her worth was measured in status connections and the flawless execution of her dinner parties. She smiled at me, a practiced cool curve of the lips that never quite reached her eyes, which always seemed to be assessing my outfit, my diction, my suitability. Then there was Victoria Carrington Daniels' younger sister, mid-30s, whip-smart in a predatory way, and fiercely ambitious. As director of investments at Atlantic Fidelity, she was her father's protégé, mirroring his drive and his disdain for anything outside their gilded world of high finance. She was fashionable, sharp-tongued, and seemed to view me less as a sister-in-law and more as an inconvenient, intellectually pretentious houseplant Daniel had inexplicably brought home. Perhaps there was a touch of jealousy masked as disdain. I was an outsider who had captured her brother's affection, an affection she might have felt she competed for against the monolith of the bank itself. Daniel, bless his heart, tried. He loved me, I never doubted that. He saw my brilliance, my worth. But he was also a product of his upbringing, conditioned by decades of Carrington dynamics and often overwhelmed when trying to bridge the chasm between my world and theirs. He was handsome, charming, and wore the Carrington suit, both literal and metaphorical, with an ease that sometimes made me feel even more out of place. The examples of their dismissal of me, my career, my very essence, are too numerous to count, but some stand out like acid-etched memories. Our first formal dinner at the Carrington estate, Eleanor, with that cool smile, inquired, "Laura, dear, Daniel tells us you're a teacher at the university. How fulfilling. Is it a full-time pursuit or more of a hobby?" Philip chimed in after I explained my PhD and research focus on systemic risk. "Academic theories are all well and good, Laura, but the real world, the market, it's a living beast. You can't learn that from books." He then turned to Daniel, booming, "Now, son, about that new commercial loan portfolio." I was dismissed. My years of study reduced to a quaint pastime. Christmas at the Carringtons was an exercise in opulence and competitive gift-giving. Conversations invariably revolved around Atlantic Fidelity's triumphs, Victoria's latest killer deal, and the intricate politics of the banking world. One year, I tried to discuss a recent Nobel Prize in economics, thinking it might be a point of common interest. Philip listened for a moment, then patted my hand. "Fascinating, dear. Absolutely fascinating. Victoria, did you tell everyone about the Henderson acquisition? Now that was a piece of work." Listen, my contribution was a conversational dead end. When Daniel received a significant promotion at the bank, one I suspected was more about his surname than his immediate merit, the Carringtons threw a lavish party. Victoria was gifted a diamond tennis bracelet for closing a relatively minor deal the same week. When Daniel proudly mentioned I'd just had a paper accepted by a leading economics journal, a significant achievement in my world, Eleanor merely said, "Oh, that's lovely, dear," before turning to instruct the caterer about the canapés. The disparity was staggering. My hard-won intellectual victory was an afterthought. I was thrilled to be invited as a keynote speaker at an international economics conference in London, a genuine honor. I mentioned it during a Sunday brunch. Victoria, sipping her mimosa, drawled, "Still playing with those dusty books and chalkboards, Laura? How quaint. Some of us are out here actually making money, you know." Philip chuckled a short, sharp sound of agreement. Daniel flushed but said nothing. Their gifts to me always underscored how little they knew or cared to know me. A generic spa voucher when I rarely had time for such things, a high-end cookbook, despite my preference for simple meals due to my demanding schedule, both at the university and secretly elsewhere. Meanwhile, Victoria would receive bespoke designer bags shares in exclusive ventures or art pieces personally selected by Philip. It wasn't about the monetary value. It was about the utter lack of thought, the clear message that I was an obligation, not a cherished family member. My early successes, graduating valedictorian, winning national essay awards, publishing research as a doctoral student, were met with the same polite, vacant disinterest. "Oh, that's nice," was the standard refrain, usually followed by a swift change of subject back to the real world of Carrington finance. The emotional foundation for my later actions was laid in those early years, brick by brick, slight by slight. It wasn't just frustration. It was a growing understanding that these people, despite their outward sophistication, were blinkered by their own arrogance, incapable of seeing value beyond their narrow definition of it. And Daniel, caught in the crossfire, could only offer sympathetic glances and whispered apologies, which over time began to feel like insufficient shields against the constant barrage. My quiet resentment began to build a slow-burning fire deep within. The years following our marriage settled into a predictable, soul-wearying pattern. Sunday dinners at the Carrington estate became a recurring stage for my subtle erasure. Holidays were grand, empty spectacles. Each family event, each milestone served only to reinforce my outsider status and the Carringtons' casual, unthinking cruelty. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts each dismissal, a tiny incision that collectively bled me dry of any hope for genuine acceptance. When I achieved tenure at Riverside State University, a significant professional accomplishment, signifying security and recognition in my academic field, I shared the news with a degree of quiet pride. Daniel was thrilled for me, understanding the years of hard work it represented. Eleanor's response, however, was classic. "Oh, tenure," she'd mused, delicately dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "So you'll be at Riverside State indefinitely? How stable?" Her tone dripped with an insinuation of stagnation, as if stable was a synonym for unambitious or stuck. Philip simply nodded, his mind already on the latest stock market fluctuations he was eager to dissect. My first book, The Architecture of Risk, Modern Finance, and Its Systemic Shadows, was published by a prestigious academic press. It was a culmination of years of research, a dense, but I believed important contribution to understanding the very kind of vulnerabilities that could topple institutions like Atlantic Fidelity. I gave Philip a copy. At the next family gathering, I saw it on a side table unopened. He picked it up when I glanced its way, leafed through a few pages with a theatrical show of effort, and said, "Dense stuff, Laura. Very thorough." Not exactly a beach read, is it? Now, Victoria just closed that merger with Allied Corp, a $500 million deal. The finesse involved the sheer audacity. That's the kind of reading I enjoy, a well-executed contract. He winked as if sharing an inside joke with everyone but me. Then there was the time I was asked to advise a small, relatively obscure congressional subcommittee on a piece of financial reform legislation. It was pro bono, a service to my field, but an honor nonetheless. I mentioned it briefly during one of Daniel's birthday dinners. "Victoria ever ready?" with a barb smirked. "Oh, busy with your little committees and their little reports, Laura. That's sweet. We're currently restructuring a $2 billion debt portfolio at the bank and advising a sovereign wealth fund. Slightly different stakes, wouldn't you say? The implication was clear. My work was child's play, hers was nation building." Meanwhile, Daniel's career at Atlantic Fidelity progressed steadily. He was competent, certainly, but his promotions often seemed to arrive with a predictability that hinted more at dynastic succession than pure merit. A new vice president title for him would warrant a champagne toast, a booming speech from Philip about Carrington blood and innate business acumen. My academic awards, my published papers, my growing reputation in economic circles. These were footnotes if mentioned at all. My internal monologue during those years became a dark, swirling current of frustration and a strange, detached curiosity about their inability to see beyond their own reflections. How many times I'd wonder, staring out the window of my university office, could one heart absorb these tiny, persistent stabs of disrespect? It wasn't overt cruelty, not usually, that I could have fought. It was worse, a soul-crushing indifference, a casual assumption of my insignificance. It was the slow erosion of my spirit in their presence. Daniel would squeeze my hand under the massive polished expanse of their dining table, a silent apology I knew was genuine. but even his love steadfast as it was often felt like a temporary bandage on a wound that never truly healed because it was constantly being picked open by the people who should have been his, and by extension, my staunchest supporters. The effort to maintain composure, to offer polite smiles, to engage in their one-sided conversations became increasingly exhausting. I remember one Sunday dinner with particular clarity. The market had been volatile and a prominent financial institution had just reported unexpected losses. I attempted to engage Philip, offering a nuanced academic perspective on the underlying liquidity issues and regulatory oversights that might have contributed. "Philip," I began, "the recent issues at Sterling Financial seem to echo some of the concerns raised in the Minsky hypothesis about prolonged periods of stability, breeding inherent instability through increased risk appetite." He waved a dismissive hand, a half-eaten shrimp still on his fork. "Laura, with all due respect, and you academics have a lot of respect for theories, these things are far simpler in practice. It's about gut instinct reading the room. It's not about textbook theories from 50 years ago." Victoria, never missing a chance to align herself with her father, added, "Exactly, Dad. We live and breathe this stuff. It's not an intellectual exercise for us. It's our reality. You can't theorize your way to $1 billion profit." Eleanor, sensing a potential breach in her carefully curated dinner party ambiance, smoothly interjected, "More wine, dear. Perhaps we can talk about something a little lighter. Victoria, darling, tell us about the upcoming charity gala for the museum. I hear your committee has secured a rather famous performer." And just like that, my attempt at intelligent discourse was swept aside, replaced by the glittering superficialities they preferred. Later that evening, back in the comforting quiet of our own modest townhouse, the facade I maintained for the Carringtons would crumble. "I'm sorry about tonight, honey," Daniel would say, his arm around me as I stared blankly at the wall. They don't understand your world." "Understand what, Daniel?" I'd snap, the accumulated frustration bubbling over. "That I have a brain, that my work has value, even if it doesn't have Atlantic fidelity stamped on the letterhead in gold leaf, that some of us are trying to prevent the kind of disasters their gut instincts could unleash. It's not like that." He'd sigh, looking pained. "They're just old-fashioned, set in their ways. They respect you in their own way." Old-fashioned or willfully ignorant and profoundly arrogant, I'd think, but often kept the bitterest words to myself for Daniel's sake. And their respect feels remarkably like condescension. My lifeline during these years, apart from Daniel's often tested love, came from outside the Carrington bubble. Dr. Alastair Finch, my PhD advisor and a man of immense intellect and quiet influence in economic circles, remained a steadfast mentor. He'd occasionally hint at opportunities, connections within governmental advisory bodies, always encouraging me to use my talents on a larger stage. "Your insights into systemic risk are too valuable to be confined to lecture halls, Laura," he'd say, his eyes twinkling. He knew I think of my family situation, though I rarely complained explicitly. He just knew. My friend Sarah Chen, a fellow professor in the sociology department at Riverside, was my more immediate sounding board. Many a frustrated Friday afternoon was spent in her cluttered office coffee cups littering the desk as I vented about the latest Carrington absurdity. "Honestly, Laura," she'd say, shaking her head, "it's like they're living in a different century. How Daniel turned out so normal is a miracle." Sarah didn't know the half of it, of course. No one did. The most recent major disappointment, the one that truly set the stage for what was to come, occurred just a few months ago. It was another Sunday dinner. Philip was particularly bombastic that evening, his chest puffed out like a pouter pigeon. He announced with great fanfare that Atlantic Fidelity Bank had just finalized the acquisition of Northern State Bank, a smaller regional competitor. "A masterstroke," he declared, beaming at Victoria, who looked insufferably smug. "Doubling our footprint in the Midwest, a strategic imperative. Took some aggressive leveraging, of course. But fortune favors the bold," Victoria chimed in. "The due diligence was intense, but we saw the synergies. Northern State was undervalued, ripe for the picking. They then, with breathtaking insensitivity, began discussing recent budget cuts at Riverside State University, a topic that had been causing considerable anxiety among my colleagues and me. "Shame about Riverside, Laura," Philip said, a mock sympathetic look on his face. "Always a struggle for these public institutions to keep up, isn't it? Market realities, I suppose." Victoria delivered the killing blow, a smirk playing on her lips. "Perhaps you should consider a real job in the real world, Laura. We might even find a little spot for you in research at AFB analyzing, well, something." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but I put a hand on his arm, my smile fixed glacial. Inside, however, a switch had flipped, because I knew something they didn't. I knew from preliminary data that had crossed my other desk, the one they knew nothing about, that Northern State Bank was a toxic asset riddled with bad loans and poorly managed. And Atlantic Fidelity, by acquiring it through what Philip called aggressive leveraging, hadn't just made a bold move. They'd potentially signed their own death warrant. The dramatic irony was a suffocating blanket. And in that moment, watching their oblivious, arrogant celebration, I felt not just resentment, but a cold, clear premonition of the storm to come, a storm I might have to unleash. Little did they know. I thought a shiver running down my spine despite the warmth of the opulent dining room. I had been documenting everything, not just their potential financial missteps, but the very real risk they were becoming to the entire system. The Northern State Bank acquisition, celebrated with such pompous self-congratulation by Philip and Victoria, became the central focus of my other life, my role as chair of the Treasury's Special Committee on Financial Stability and Risk Management. This wasn't a little committee, as Victoria had once sneered. It was a high-level, discrete body tasked with identifying and mitigating threats to the nation's financial health. My professorship at Riverside State, so often belittled by the Carringtons, provided the perfect cover for the intense classified work I conducted from my secure home study and a nondescript office in the Treasury's regional headquarters. The contrast was stark. One part of my day might involve lecturing on Keynesian theory or meeting with graduate students. The other involved secure video conferences with the Treasury Secretary, poring over encrypted data streams and directing a team of brilliant, dedicated analysts. My home study, which Daniel thought was merely for university work, was a fortress of information equipped with secure lines and shielded from any casual observation. Late nights became the norm, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of urgency. The escalation of the Atlantic Fidelity Bank AFB investigation happened in waves, each one more alarming than the last. Even before the Northern State deal, AFB had pinged on our committee's radar. Their aggressive lending practices in commercial real estate and their increasing reliance on short-term wholesale funding were noted in our routine systemic risk assessments. Nothing overtly illegal, perhaps, but a pattern of pushing boundaries. I remember briefing Secretary Margaret Collins, "AFB is sailing close to the wind, Madam Secretary. Their risk appetite seems to be outpacing their controls." She nodded, her expression serious. "Keep a close watch, Laura. Carrington has a reputation for boldness." As chair, I directed my lead analyst, Jonathan Reed, a brilliant, tireless young man with a mind like a steel trap, to conduct a more thorough review of AFB's portfolio. What we began to uncover was unsettling, complex, off-balance sheet entities seemingly designed to obscure leverage, overly optimistic valuations of certain asset classes, and a culture that appeared to prioritize growth at any cost. My heart sank with each new discovery. This wasn't just abstract data. This was Daniel's family, his father's legacy. But the numbers were ruthless, and they were telling a story of mounting danger. Then came the news of the Northern State Bank acquisition. Philip's boast about aggressive leveraging was an understatement. When our team modeled the impact of this deal on AFB's already strained capital reserves, the projections were catastrophic. Northern State, as my initial private intelligence had suggested and our deeper dive confirmed, was riddled with non-performing loans and had its own set of questionable accounting practices. Bolting it onto AFB was like tying an anchor to a swimmer in a storm. Jonathan presented the figures to me, his face grim. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "their Tier 1 capital ratio post-acquisition under any kind of stress test. It's critical. They've essentially bet the farm, and the farm is on fire." The pressure was building. Then something unexpected happened. An encrypted anonymous email landed in our committee's secure inbox. It was short, cryptic, but pointed directly to specific internal malfeasance at AFB concerning the Northern State due diligence. It alleged that senior management, including Philip, had been explicitly warned by their own internal risk assessment team about the dangers of the acquisition, but had overridden those concerns, suppressing the negative report. This was no longer just reckless ambition. This was bordering on deliberate deception, potentially misleading shareholders and regulators. The email provided just enough unverifiable detail to be tantalizing and deeply worrying. We couldn't use it as direct evidence, but it narrowed our focus. Armed with the insights from the anonymous tip, we pushed harder, using our regulatory authority to request specific internal documentation around the Northern State deal. After some initial resistance and claims of confidentiality, the documents started to arrive. And there it was. Buried deep within a mountain of due diligence material was a heavily redacted internal audit addendum. But through painstaking cross-referencing and leveraging other data points, Jonathan managed to reconstruct key portions. It confirmed the anonymous tip Philip Carrington, with Victoria's apparent support, had received a stark warning from their own chief risk officer about the perilous financial state of Northern State and the unacceptable leverage AFB would have to take on. A handwritten note scanned with the document in what looked like Philip's imperious scrawl read, "Proceed, manage perception, growth is paramount." This was it. The evidence of willful negligence, of prioritizing ego and expansion over prudence and stability. The weight of this knowledge was immense. Sleepless nights were filled with the faces of the Carringtons, Philip's arrogant pronouncements, Victoria's dismissive smirks, Eleanor's superficial charm. But they were also filled with the potential faces of ordinary people whose lives could be devastated by a bank collapse, employees, depositors, small business owners who relied on AFB. The strain began to show. Daniel noticed my preoccupation, my exhaustion. One evening, he found me in my study, not at my usual university desk, but surrounded by printouts of financial tables, my expression bleak. "Laura, what is going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You look haunted. You're working yourself into the ground. Is it the university budget cuts? Something more?" I couldn't tell him. Not yet. The secrecy of my treasury role was absolute. "It's complicated, Dan." I managed my voice hoarse. "Very complicated. A major project with a tight deadline and enormous stakes." It was the truth, just not the whole truth. He looked like he wanted to press, but he respected my boundaries, trusting me. That trust felt like another heavy weight. To understand Philip Carrington's reckless drive, one had to understand his lineage. His father, Arthur Carrington, had built Atlantic Fidelity from a small, respectable community bank into a significant regional player through careful, conservative growth. Philip, however, seemed to live in his father's shadow, possessed by a relentless need to prove he was bigger, bolder, more visionary. He craved the spotlight, the accolades of the financial press, the title of Titan. This wasn't just business, it was ego. Eleanor, his wife, enabled this basking in the reflected glory of his perceived success, her social standing intrinsically linked to the bank's prominence. Victoria, in turn, idolized her father, mimicking his ambition and his ruthlessness, desperate for his approval, which he doled out sparingly, usually only when she mirrored his own aggressive tactics. My internal transformation was accelerating. The initial trepidation, the personal conflict of investigating my own family-in-law, was steadily being burned away by a cold, hard anger. Anger at their arrogance, their willful blindness, and the sheer scale of the risk they were imposing on innocent people. The economist in me, the public servant, the guardian of financial stability that Secretary Collins had entrusted me to be, took complete ascendancy. They made their bed, I thought grimly, staring at the damning evidence on my screen. And it's a bed of lies, inflated egos, and reckless gambles. I will not let them drag the entire regional economy down with them just to satisfy Philip Carrington's vanity. My allies were few, but powerful Jonathan Reed, whose analytical brilliance and unwavering loyalty were indispensable. Secretary of the Treasury, Margaret Collins, a woman of formidable intellect and political courage, who had placed immense trust in my judgment. Elijah Brooks, the pragmatic and deeply concerned chairman of the Federal Reserve, who understood the contagion risk better than anyone. Elena Rodriguez, the sharp, no-nonsense director of enforcement at the SEC, whose focus was on market integrity and investor protection. And Daniel, my unsuspecting husband, whose love and inherent decency were an emotional anchor in the storm, even if he didn't know the nature of the tempest I was navigating. The enemies, of course, were Philip and Victoria, and by extension, Eleanor. They were not enemies in a conventional sense. They were simply the architects of their own impending doom, their arrogance the very weapon that would bring them down. The stakes were now terrifyingly high. A collapse of Atlantic Fidelity, especially after the Northern State acquisition, wouldn't just be a localized failure. It had the potential to trigger a regional financial crisis, freezing credit markets, threatening businesses, and wiping out savings. The domino effect was a very real possibility. And I, Dr. Laura Bennett, the Quiet University professor, held the evidence, the analysis, and the terrible responsibility of deciding the next move. I finalized my report late one Tuesday night. It was over 100 pages dense with data charts and a meticulously documented narrative of mismanagement and systemic risk. It was, in a word, damning. I reread the executive summary, my heart pounding, a mixture of adrenaline and a grim sense of finality coursing through me. There was no other choice. I picked up the secure phone on my desk, the one that bypassed all normal channels. "Secretary Collins, please. It's Dr. Bennett." A moment later, her calm, authoritative voice came on the line. "Laura, what have you got?" "Madam Secretary," I said, my own voice steady despite the tremor in my soul. "The report on Atlantic Fidelity Bank is complete. The findings are conclusive. It's time to convene the emergency meeting of the Financial Stability Oversight Subcommittee. And yes," I took a deep breath, "I will need Philip Carrington there in person." There was a brief pause. "Understood, Laura. I'll make the arrangements. Are you prepared for this?" "Yes, Madam Secretary," I replied. "I am." As I hung up, a chilling thought echoed. But what I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of the storm, and the eye of it was pointed directly at the Carrington family dinner table, metaphorically speaking, ready to obliterate everything they thought they knew. The quiet professor was about to roar. The die was cast. The days leading up to the emergency meeting were a blur of intense preparation, a strange calm settling over the storm within me. This phase wasn't about me discovering more about Atlantic Fidelity's precarious situation. That grim chapter was complete. This was about the impending revelation the Carringtons, specifically Philip and Victoria, were about to discover the truth about me, about the quiet academic they'd so consistently underestimated. The truth bomb wasn't just the data on a screen, it was the shattering of their perception of who I was and the power I wielded. Holding the finalized bound report in my hands, its sheer weight felt symbolic. Each page was a testament to months of meticulous investigation, late nights, and the unwavering dedication of my team. There was a grim satisfaction in its thoroughness, but also a profound sense of the gravity of the situation. This document would bring down an empire tarnish, a legacy, and irrevocably alter the lives of a family I was by marriage at least a part of. A flicker of sadness for Daniel for the inevitable pain this would cause him passed through me, but it was quickly overridden by a steely resolve. My duty was clear, my purpose unshakable. They had gambled with public trust, with economic stability, all for the sake of ego and ambition. They wanted me to be small, I mused, dressing carefully on the morning of the meeting. They are about to find out just how expansive my world truly is and how sharp its edges can be when protecting the greater good. My internal monologue was a constant rehearsal of facts, a bracing for impact. The professor persona, the one they cultivated for me in their minds, the one they found so easy to dismiss, was about to be shed like an old skin. Today, Dr. Laura Bennett, chair of the Treasury's Special Committee on Financial Stability and Risk Management, was about to enter the room. And she wasn't here to discuss economic theory over canapes or listen to condescending pronouncements about the real world. She was here to deliver hard truths and execute necessary painful actions. The decision to act had been made weeks ago, solidified by the discovery of that damning internal memo. Now was the execution. I coordinated closely with Secretary Margaret Collins, Elijah Brooks from the Federal Reserve, and Elena Rodriguez from the SEC were fully briefed and aligned. The secure conference room at the Treasury's regional headquarters was prepared, a sterile, imposing space designed for serious business. Our evidence was compiled into a devastatingly clear presentation, legal teams from all three agencies on standby. The official summons to Philip Carrington was delivered by Treasury Courier, formal, concise, non-negotiable. It requested his presence, along with his Chief Investment Officer, Victoria, of course, for a meeting concerning matters of urgent regulatory importance pertaining to Atlantic Fidelity Bank. I imagined Philip's reaction, annoyance certainly, perhaps a touch of arrogance. He likely thought it was a bureaucratic formality, a chance for him to lecture some government officials on the complexities of modern banking, or perhaps a consultation given AFB's size and his perceived influence. He might even have planned to patronize them, to charm or intimidate them, as he was accustomed to doing. Victoria would likely mirror his confidence, perhaps seeing it as another opportunity to demonstrate her indispensability to her father. The morning of the meeting, an uncharacteristic stillness settled over our townhouse. Daniel, sensing the unusual tension in me, despite my outward composure, watched me as I chose a severe dark gray suit, a crisp white blouse. It was armor. "Big day at the university, Hunma-kun?" he asked, his brow furrowed with a hint of worry. I managed a small smile, kissing him goodbye. The kiss felt more significant than usual, a silent acknowledgement of a threshold I was about to cross. "Something like that, Daniel," I said softly. "Something very important. I love you." His eyes held mine for a moment longer than usual. "I love you too, Laura. Whatever it is, you'll handle it. You always do." His faith in me, so innocent of the true nature of the day, was both a comfort and a pang to my heart. As I drove to the Treasury building, the city seemed to hum with a nervous energy that matched my own. I pictured Philip and Victoria arriving, exuding their usual aura of unshakable self-importance. They would stride into the Treasury building expecting deference, perhaps even a degree of awe. They would be anticipating a discussion they could control, manipulate. Little did they know, I murmured to myself, my hands gripping the steering wheel, I had been documenting everything. Not just their financial malfeasance, but years of their casual cruelty, their dismissive smirks, their utter conviction of my insignificance. And the universe, or in this case, the U.S., Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the Securities and Exchange Commission were about to serve a reckoning delivered by the very person they never saw coming. The anticipation was a knot in my stomach, not of fear, but of a resolute, almost righteous readiness. The truth bomb was primed and the countdown had begun. The conference room at the Treasury's regional headquarters was as I'd pictured, austere, intimidating, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the cold, fluorescent light. Water glasses and notepads were set at precise intervals. At the head of the table sat Secretary of the Treasury Margaret Collins, her expression serious, flanked by Elijah Brooks, chairman of the Federal Reserve, his brow furrowed in characteristic thoughtfulness, and Elena Rodriguez, Director of Enforcement for the SEC, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. My trusted lead analyst, Jonathan Reed, sat a little further down, a laptop open before him, ready to project our findings. I took my seat to Secretary Collins's right, a simple nameplate in front of me, Dr. Laura Bennett, Chair, Special Committee on Financial Stability and Risk Management. The door opened and Philip Carrington strode in, Victoria a step behind him. Philip, ever the master of the grand entrance, exuded an air of slightly put-upon importance, as if this meeting were an inconvenient detour from his far more critical affairs. Victoria mirrored his expression, her tailored suit exuding sharp ambition. They offered brisk, confident greetings to Secretary Collins, a nod to Brooks and Rodriguez that was perhaps a fraction less deferential. Their eyes swept past me, a flicker of non-recognition, or perhaps just dismissal. The professor daughter-in-law was so far out of context here, she might as well have been part of the furniture. If they registered my presence at all, it was with a fleeting, dismissive glance. Secretary Collins waited until they were seated, then began, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Carrington, Ms. Carrington, thank you for coming. We have a serious matter to discuss regarding Atlantic Fidelity Bank and its recent acquisition of Northern State Bank. This meeting is being led by the chair of our Special Committee on Financial Stability and Risk Management, Dr. Laura Bennett. Collins gestured towards me. Time seemed to slow. Philip and Victoria turned their heads. Their eyes locked onto me, then onto my nameplate. The confident expressions faltered, replaced by a wave of stunned disbelief. Philip's jaw, which had been set in an authoritative line, went slack. Victoria's perfectly applied lipstick seemed to pale against her suddenly ashen skin. Philip let out a short, incredulous laugh, a nervous barking sound. Laura, what in God's name is this? Some kind of university research project you've roped the Treasury into? Is this a joke? Victoria simply stared, her eyes wide, darting from me to Secretary Collins and back again, a dawning horror beginning to etch itself onto her features. I stood, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my voice when I spoke was steady, devoid of the tremor I felt inside. Hello, Philip. Victoria. No dad, no familial titles. This was not their dining room. This was my arena. My voice was different here. Sharper, more formal, carrying an authority they had never heard from me. This is no joke, Philip. I continued, my gaze unwavering. And it's far from a university project. Please allow me to begin. Jonathan dimmed the lights slightly, and the first slide of my presentation appeared on the large screen. Atlantic Fidelity Bank, Systemic Risk Assessment, Confidential, U.S. Department of the Treasury. I began to speak, laying out the facts with cold, irrefutable precision. Charts, graphs, internal AFB documents, including a damningly highlighted copy of the suppressed Northern State audit and Philip's handwritten directive. I detailed the aggressive over-leveraging, the perilous lack of capital adequacy post-acquisition, the falsified optimism in their public statements versus the stark reality of their internal risk assessments, the systemic threat AFB now posed. Philip started to bluster, his face reddening. Now see here, these are internal bank matters. This is an outrageous mischaracterization, Laura. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you are way out of your depth. He slammed a hand on the table. Secretary Collins cut him off, her voice like ice. Mr. Carrington, Dr. Bennett has the floor. I strongly suggest you listen very carefully. Your attempts to intimidate or deflect will not be tolerated. Philip visibly deflated, sinking back into his chair, though his eyes still shot daggers of fury and disbelief at me. Victoria was silent, her gaze fixed on the screen, her composure visibly cracking with each damning slide. The truth revelations came one after another, like hammer blows. The first and most personal bomb, that Laura Bennett, the quiet academic they'd dismissed for years, was not only a leading expert in their field, but held a position of significant governmental power, one that now held their fate in its hands. The sheer scale of their bank's problems laid bare, with unassailable evidence. It was clear this went far beyond any sanitized version Philip might have presented to his board or even admitted to himself. The horrifying realization for them that I, the one they considered insignificant, had meticulously and expertly uncovered their recklessness and was now wielding the authority to bring it all crashing down. The irony was a bitter pill they were forced to swallow. The dawning understanding that this wasn't just a slap on the wrist, this was existential. The power dynamic in the room had completely, irrevocably reversed. I was in control, calm and methodical. Philip, accustomed to dominating every room he entered, was reduced to a sputtering, increasingly desperate figure. Victoria looked physically ill, her sharp intelligence now useless against the tidal wave of evidence. The other officials, Collins, Brooks, Rodriguez, watched with grim professional detachment, their presence a silent Greek chorus, underscoring the severity of the moment. The humiliation for Philip and Victoria in front of these titans of finance and regulation was palpable. Philip's face contorted, cycling through anger, denial, and a dawning abject fear. This can't be right," he stammered, his voice losing its customary boom. "You've misinterpreted the data. These are aggressive but sound strategies. Northern State is a turnaround opportunity." Victoria finally spoke, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, a stark contrast to her usual confident tone. "The projections, they seemed viable. We had contingencies." Her eyes pleaded not with me, but with some unseen force for this nightmare to end. I didn't flinch. I let the data speak. Then I delivered my summary, looking directly at Philip, then Victoria. "The numbers, Philip, don't lie. Your gut was demonstrably wrong. Your instincts, Victoria, have endangered not just your bank, but potentially a significant portion of the regional economy, and by extension have posed a threat to national financial stability. Therefore," I paused, letting the weight of my next words sink in. "Based on the comprehensive findings of this committee, and in full consultation with the Federal Reserve and the Securities and Exchange Commission, it is our collective determination that Atlantic Fidelity Bank is critically undercapitalized, poses a significant and immediate systemic risk, and has demonstrated a pattern of reckless mismanagement and deliberate obfuscation reaching to the highest levels of its leadership." A heavy silence filled the room. Then Secretary Collins spoke, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Mr. Carrington, Ms. Carrington, effective immediately pursuant to the powers vested in us by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, specifically Title II, Orderly Liquidation Authority, the U.S. Treasury, in coordination with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Federal Reserve, is placing Atlantic Fidelity Bank into receivership under the control of the FDIC to ensure an orderly resolution, protect depositors, and safeguard the wider financial system. You, Mr. Carrington, are hereby relieved of your duties as Chief Executive Officer and are banned from participating in the affairs of any federally insured depository institution pending further civil and potentially criminal investigation." She turned to Victoria. "Ms. Carrington, your actions as Chief Investment Officer, particularly concerning the due diligence and representations made regarding the Northern State Bank acquisition, will be subject to a full investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for potential violations of securities laws. You are also relieved of your duties, effective immediately." The hammer had fallen. Karma didn't just come for them. It brought an entire army of federal regulators armed with facts and the full force of the law. Philip slumped in his chair, as if struck by a physical blow. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a gray, pasty despair. "My bank. My father's bank," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Laura, how could you—" The question was laced with a bewildered personal betrayal, utterly missing the larger point of his own culpability. Victoria stared blankly ahead, tears welling in her eyes, her ambition, her carefully constructed career dissolving before her. She might have tried a last desperate plea. I had concerns. I tried to voice them. But Dad—" But her voice trailed off. The lie too transparent, too late. My moment of triumph was not one of gloating, but of a profound, solemn vindication. The years of being underestimated, of having my intellect dismissed, of being treated as an irrelevant academic, all of it had culminated in this. My expertise, my integrity, were not just validated. They had been instrumental in averting a potential crisis. As Treasury officials quietly entered the room to begin the formal process of takeover, escorting a shell-shocked Philip and a weeping Victoria out, Secretary Collins placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did what had to be done, Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice firm but with an undertone of respect. "Difficult but necessary. Excellent work. You've likely saved us from a much larger crisis." I nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over me, but beneath it a deep, private sense of justice served. The quiet professor had indeed roared, and the sound had shaken the foundations of a corrupt and arrogant empire. The hours and days that followed the confrontation were a maelstrom. The news broke with the force of a thunderclap. "Regulators seize Atlantic Fidelity Bank," screamed the headlines. CEO Philip Carrington ousted amidst allegations of gross mismanagement and systemic risk. Financial news channels went into overdrive. Atlantic Fidelity's publicly traded stock, already battered by rumors, was halted and then effectively became worthless. Official statements from the Treasury, the Fed, and the FDIC praised the decisive and coordinated regulatory action and the thorough investigation by a special Treasury committee that had uncovered the depth of the rot. My name, Dr. Laura Bennett, as chair of that committee, was mentioned initially discreetly, then with increasing frequency as journalists dug deeper. Sources lauded committee chair's expertise and unwavering commitment to financial stability. The most immediate personal fallout, of course, was with Daniel. I called him before the news became public, asking him to come home from the office immediately. He arrived, his face etched with confusion and concern at my urgent summons. I sat him down on our familiar sofa in the modest living room that had always been our sanctuary from the Carrington opulence, and I told him, not every classified detail, but the essence, my secret role, the long investigation into Atlantic Fidelity, the irrefutable evidence of his father's and sister's recklessness, and the emergency meeting that had just concluded. He listened, his face paling, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrified understanding. "My God, Laura," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. "Atlantic Fidelity, Dad, Victoria, and you. All this time, you knew this was happening. You were investigating my family." The pain in his voice was a knife to my heart, but I met his gaze steadily. "Daniel, I was investigating a bank that posed a severe threat to economic stability, a threat caused by the decisions made by its leadership. My loyalty in my professional capacity had to be to the integrity of the system, to the public good. It became clear that Philip and Victoria were not just making bad decisions, they were endangering everything." It was a long, difficult conversation. He was torn understandably between his love for me and his innate loyalty to his family, however flawed. There were tears, moments of anger from him. "How could you not tell me, Laura, we're married?" Moments of deep sorrow. But beneath the turmoil, Daniel's inherent decency, his respect for integrity, the very qualities that had drawn me to him, began to surface. "So, Dad's empire, it was all a house of cards?" he asked, the reality sinking in. "And you were the only one brave enough to call it out." By the time the news alerts started flooding his phone, he was still reeling, but a new understanding was dawning. This wasn't a betrayal by me, but a consequence of their actions. The reactions from the rest of the Carrington clan were predictable yet still jarring. Went into seclusion in what remained of his diminished world. The opulent estate suddenly felt like a gilded prison. He was shell-shocked, his reputation in tatters, facing a barrage of legal threats from the SEC, FDIC, and likely shareholder lawsuits. His calls to influential friends, the ones he'd cultivated over decades, were met with polite but firm refusals of help. His power stripped away revealed him as just an old man who had gambled and lost spectacularly. His rage, I heard later through Daniel, was immense, but impotent. Publicly, she was mortified. Her carefully constructed social universe imploded. The invitations dried up, the whispered calls she did receive were laced with pity or worse, schadenfreude. Her initial reaction, relayed haltingly by Daniel, was to blame me. How could Laura do this to us? To Daniel's family, after all we've done for her? The irony of that last part was apparently lost on her. Panicked. Her carefully crafted career was not just over, it was radioactive. She was lawyering up, terrified of SEC charges and potential disbarment from any financial industry roles. Her fury at me was white-hot, but it was the fury of a cornered animal laced with fear. Eleanor did try to call me a few days later. Her voice, usually so coolly modulated, was trembling. "Laura, you have to do something. You have to tell them it was a mistake. Philip is a broken man. Daniel is your husband. Think of the family." I listened patiently, then responded, my voice firm, but not unkind. "Eleanor, what happened was the direct result of Philip's and Victoria's actions and decisions over a very long period. There was no mistake in the analysis. My responsibility and that of the Treasury is to financial stability and the public trust. I understand this is incredibly painful for you and for Daniel, and I am truly sorry for that pain. But the actions taken were necessary and unavoidable." There was a choked sob, then she hung up. I set my boundaries. There was no gloating, only the clear, unwavering line of professional responsibility. Support came from unexpected quarters. A few anonymous emails, untraceable, found their way to my university address, purportedly from mid-level employees at Atlantic Fidelity, expressing quiet gratitude that the madness at the top had finally been stopped. Dr. Alistair Finch called his voice filled with pride. "I always knew your intellect would take you to extraordinary places, Laura. You've done a great service." Secretary Collins Elijah Brooks and Elena Rodriguez publicly backed the committee's findings without reservation, shielding me from any political blowback, which was surprisingly minimal given the bank's former clout. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. The most crucial support, however, came from Daniel. After the initial shock and days of anguished processing, he came to me, his eyes clear, though shadowed with sadness for his family's downfall. He took my hands. "Laura," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about Dad, Victoria, about everything, about you, and I am so incredibly proud of you. What you did, it took immense courage, integrity. You stood up for what was right, even knowing what it would cost personally. You're remarkable." He pulled me into a hug, and I felt a profound wave of relief. Our marriage, tested by this extraordinary crucible, would survive. It would be stronger. Social media and financial forums were of course abuzz. Speculation, hot takes, armchair analyses. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of relief that a potential crisis had been averted and praise for the decisive regulatory action. The Carrington mystique had been shattered. In the short term, the Carrington family dynamics were obliterated. The opulent estate, once a symbol of their power, now felt like a mausoleum of their arrogance. Philip was a pariah, Eleanor a social outcast. Victoria was fighting for her professional survival. Daniel, while supporting his parents and sister as best he could, emotionally created a necessary distance from their toxicity, focusing on our life, our future. The condescending family dinners were a thing of the past. The power had shifted utterly and completely. My own emotional processing was complex. There was the immense relief that a crisis had been averted, the quiet satisfaction of professional competence validated on the highest stage. There was lingering sadness for Daniel, and the pain this had caused him, but no guilt for my actions. I had done my duty. Staring at my reflection, I no longer saw just Professor Bennett constantly trying to justify her existence. I saw a woman who had faced down immense pressure, personal and professional, and had not buckled. In the end, I thought, the truth didn't just set me free. It rebuilt me stronger piece by painful, powerful piece. And it turns out the truth has a hell of a P&L statement. 2 years passed. 2 years that reshaped not only the financial landscape in our region, but also the contours of my life and the shattered remnants of the Carrington family. Dr. Laura Bennett, the once dismissed university professor, was now a name recognized in circles far beyond academia. While I consciously shied away from the glare of excessive media attention, my role in the Atlantic Fidelity Resolution had become public knowledge. I'd been subsequently appointed as a special advisor to the Treasury Secretary on banking reform, and several key provisions of the new regulatory framework aimed at preventing similar crises were informally dubbed the Bennett reforms by the financial press, a moniker I found both humbling and a little surreal. I still held an adjunct professorship at Riverside State guest lecturing occasionally. Grounding my policy work in academic rigor and sharing knowledge with the next generation remained important to me. It was a connection to the intellectual curiosity that had started it all. My relationship with Daniel had not just survived the cataclysm, it had been forged into something far deeper and more resilient. The ordeal had stripped away all pretenses. He saw me fully. My strength, my intellect, my unwavering moral compass, and his love and respect were constants in my life. Our modest townhouse, once a refuge, now felt like a fortress of shared understanding and quiet joy. We were stronger together than we had ever been apart. We were even talking about starting a family, a future that had seemed impossible, amidst the turmoil now felt like a hopeful dawn. As for the Carringtons' karma, as they say, hadn't just knocked on their door, it had kicked it down and repossessed the furniture. Karma didn't just come for them, it brought an entire army of auditors, lawyers, and the enduring stain of public shame. He faced severe SEC charges, resulting in crippling fines that consumed most of his personal fortune, which had been deeply intertwined with Atlantic Fidelity's inflated stock. He accepted a plea deal that involved a lifetime ban from the banking industry and any officer or director role in a public company. He avoided jail time primarily due to his age and rapidly declining health. The stress had taken a visible toll. He lived quietly now, a ghost of his former domineering self, in a much smaller, unpretentious house that Daniel helped him secure. The arrogance was gone, extinguished, replaced by a bitter, hollow regret. Daniel visited him regularly, an act of filial duty rather than affection. Philip rarely spoke of the bank or of me. The subject was too raw, the defeat too absolute. The opulent Carrington estate, with its crushing upkeep costs and haunting memories, was sold at a loss. Eleanor moved into a tasteful but significantly more modest condominium. Her glittering social circle had evaporated like morning mist. The society pages no longer featured her name. The solitude and loss, however, had an unexpected effect. About a year after the AFB collapse, she called me. It was Daniel who had urged her gently. Her voice was hesitant, fragile, stripped of its former artifice. "Laura," she began. Daniel thought, "I should call. I owe you an apology, my dear, a profound one, for all those years. For how I treated you." There was a pause, a shaky breath. We were fools, blinded by, I don't even know what, arrogance, ignorance. We underestimated you so terribly. We were awful. And you were simply doing what was right, what was necessary. I see that now, truly. Can you ever forgive an old woman her monumental foolishness? Her apology, raw and seemingly genuine, was a startling moment of grace. "Eleanor," I said softly, "I appreciate that more than you know. Perhaps in time we can all find a way to heal." It wasn't full absolution, but it was a beginning. Justice wasn't just served, it was a 5-course meal, and humility was the unexpected dessert. She too faced SEC sanctions, though less severe than her father's. She received a multi-year ban from holding officer or director positions in the financial industry and paid substantial fines. Her high-flying career at the pinnacle of finance was definitively over. The initial bitterness had over time given way to a grudging acceptance. She had to reinvent herself. In an ironic twist of fate, she started a small consultancy firm advising nonprofit organizations on financial management, and more recently had begun volunteering to teach basic financial literacy workshops in underserved communities. She was humbled quieter, the sharp edges softened by adversity. Our relationship was civil maintained for Daniel's sake during rare small family occasions. The old disdain was gone, replaced by a wary, almost awed respect. The family dynamics were utterly transformed. The once mighty Carrington triumvirate of Philip, Eleanor, and Victoria was fractured, slowly reforming into something more honest, less pretentious, and significantly diminished in scope. Daniel was the reluctant fulcrum navigating these new, more subdued relationships with grace and firm boundaries. When we did see his family, usually for quiet holiday meals at our home, the conversations were different. No more talk of deals and conquests, no more casual dismissals of my world. I was no longer the academic Laura. I was Dr. Bennett, the woman who had stared down a financial crisis, and won the woman whose quiet expertise had proven more potent than all their bluster. My professional network had, of course, expanded significantly. I was a respected voice in policy discussions, my opinions sought by government agencies and think tanks. My friendship with Sarah Chen remained a source of comfort and normalcy. My professional bonds with Secretary Collins, now a mentor and friend, Elijah Brooks, and Elena Rodriguez, were forged in the fire of that crisis, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Reflecting on the journey, I marveled at the insidious nature of condescension, how it can subtly erode one's spirit if allowed. I learned the profound importance of unwavering integrity, even when the personal cost is high. I understood that true power doesn't reside in inherited wealth or an inflated ego, but in knowledge, competence, and the courage to wield them responsibly. The Carringtons had built their castle on foundations of sand, dazzled by its glittering facade, ignoring the structural weaknesses within. I hadn't sought to destroy it. I had simply brought the tide of truth, and the edifice, unable to withstand it, had crumbled under its own weight. What goes around doesn't just come around, it multiplies, especially when it's built on a bedrock of arrogance. The peace I felt was profound, a quiet harbor after a long and turbulent voyage. So what's the deep moral of this rather wild story? I think there are a few. Firstly, never ever underestimate the quiet ones. Still, waters often run incredibly deep and can carve canyons through mountains of arrogance. Secondly, true power isn't about the loudest voice in the room or the biggest bank account. It's about integrity, expertise, and the courage to use them for the greater good. Those qualities are far more enduring than inherited wealth or an inflated ego. Thirdly, the truth, no matter how deeply buried or artfully concealed, always has a way of surfacing, and sometimes it does so with the force of a tsunami. And perhaps most importantly, for those of you navigating complex family dynamics, true family, the kind that nurtures and sustains, is built on respect and support. It uplifts. It doesn't diminish or belittle. It's absolutely possible and often necessary to enforce boundaries and demand the respect you deserve, even if it means upending long-established unhealthy dynamics. Sometimes the most loving act is to hold a mirror up to destructive behavior. I have a few questions for you, the incredible community watching and reading. Have you ever had to be the one to speak a hard truth, even when it was unpopular or personally costly? Who in your life, perhaps someone quiet and unassuming, deserves more recognition for their quiet expertise and unwavering integrity? And let's be honest, what's the biggest truth bomb you've ever witnessed or had the courage to drop? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the underdog who finally got their due, or if you simply believe in the power of truth and quiet strength, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of triumph, justice, and the complexities of human nature. Share this story with anyone who needs a reminder of their own inherent strength or the profound impact of quiet competence. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So comment below with a lesson you learned from this, or perhaps a time you saw karma deliver a particularly satisfying 5-course meal. Let's build a community of truth-tellers and resilient spirits. Remember, your value isn't determined by those who refuse to see it or those who try to diminish it. Your worth is inherent. Own your expertise, stand firmly in your truth, and never ever let anyone make you feel small. You are far more powerful than you think. Thank you for being part of this journey. I have so many more stories to share and stories of resilience. Unexpected turns justice served and the incredible, often underestimated strength of the human spirit. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on what's next. Until then, stay strong, stay true, and never stop believing in your own power.